Hello, everyone. Welcome to my space on the Ukraine question and Russia. Master Sheikh will be joining us quite soon. I'll add him as a co-host. I'm very happy to have him along. He offers a lot of detail, also perspective that I that I think really supplements what I'm doing here, makes it deeper, more important. I think we agree on a lot of important things, and we have some disagreements around the way as well. Okay, I have added him in. So we are living through history. I think that is quite clear. Yesterday, um, Putin gave a really dramatic speech in which he recognized the breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine and the Donbass regions. Now, these emerged in 2014 due to the Maidan crisis and so on. And they were kind of in a state of ambiguity for some time. They were obviously pro-Russian entities. They were filled with Russian speakers, in fact, but they certainly were not annexed or brought into the Russian Federation. And they were, involved in some hot conflicts with the Ukrainian government, Kiev. So it was an ambiguous, dangerous situation, to say the least. Putin has recognized those provinces, but he actually went many steps further. So in this speech, he claimed that he was going to punish those involved with the attacks on a hospital, I believe, a kind of a burning down of a building. It was a terrible incident, led to the deaths of dozens. He was going to bring these people to justice. Well, the only way that would be possible would be to exert control over Ukraine in general. So that is a very bold claim. He made even bolder claims. There's an interesting thing that I read about not too long ago, but well before the Maidan, and in fact, well before the 2004 Ukrainian crisis, there was a logistical, or excuse me, not logistical, linguistic change that occurred in Kremlin documentation about what Ukraine is. And this is something that is difficult to translate into English. I would add that I am not a Russian speaker, so I'm simply relying on the ways that this is conveyed. But when a territory is controlled by a state, a certain preposition is used. Let's call it in. So you could say that I took a vacation in England. So we are in a country that is ruled by a state. When a country is not governed by its own independent state, we would use the preposition on. Now, again, this is translating from Russian. I'm not a Russian speaker. It's not perfect, but bear with me. And so the Kremlin was using the preposition on Ukraine effectively. That is, it is making a differentiation that is actually very important. It is a linguistic way of questioning the sovereignty of Ukraine. In his speech, Putin went much further than that, effectively claiming that Ukraine is an invention, really kind of disrespecting Ukraine in a historical way that is very bold indeed. So you don't make statements like that is question a country's sovereignty, if you aren't going to do something. Questioning the sovereignty of a country is a kind of linguistic act of war. Now, we could, of course, go into details about whether Putin was right or wrong or half right about certain historical issues, but the fact is he was absolutely questioning the legitimacy and sovereignty of Ukraine as a nation state. Let's bring in Master Sheikh here. I will just say this. I guess he is a co-host now, so he can unmute his mic if he's ready. I think after what has happened, a full invasion of the country is certainly possible, and I would say it's probable. I don't know, bells can't be unrung, and statements like that can't just be taken back. And this is going to start in stages, and the initial stage is a recognition of these independent regions, which in itself is contesting the territorial integrity of Ukraine. In itself is extremely provocative. But I get a very strong sense, call me hysteric, if you will, that we are going to see a long-term conflict, and that this will include a kind of full attempt of bringing the entirety of Ukraine back into the Russian fold. What do you think about that, Master Sheikh?
Well, hi, Richard.
Hey.
So, yesterday's speech by Putin, I actually watched it live on a Russian TV channel. I got to say that I'm not actually really impressed by it. It's the usual Russian history lessons, giving a long lecture about history, about certain historic nuances that no one else really cares about. Then going into this tangent about, well, Ukraine being fake and an invention by the Bolsheviks or communists or whatever. And then towards the end, he spoke about this Soviet nostalgia that both Russia and Ukraine lost their common homeland, being the Soviet Union. I don't know. It was all over the place, and there was really nothing new said in that speech. But yeah, let's try to maybe go over a bit some of the points he made. Well, the speech in general, it sort of revealed what everyone was sort of thinking about already for a while. But also, everyone was sort of thinking about, well, what Putin wants. So, what are his goals? And he sort of silhouetted them in his speech and the following signing of those decrees recognizing those so-called people's republics. So now we have a little bit more of a sense of what's going on and what we could really expect. I don't really think that full-on invasion of Ukraine will happen.
Okay.
The amount of forces that is amassed on the borders of Ukraine is simply not enough to do this. Already, as I read some military analysis here on Twitter and some other places, about three-quarters of Russian armed forces, like their land army, is amassed on the Ukraine's borders. But this is simple. Like the biggest estimate is like 190,000 troops.
Right.
The Ukrainian army is battle ready. They have like 200,000 troops, plus the reserves, plus the veterans of the what they call in Ukraine the anti-terror operation, which is ongoing in the east, because they recognize those people's republics as terrorist entities and separatists. And they have a lot more veterans from that conflict, ongoing conflict. So Russia would really have to go all in use all its military forces and all its reserves to take Ukraine and then occupy it. And I don't believe Russia is capable of doing that. What I think that they're capable of doing is, now that they have recognized the sovereignty of those so-called people's republics, although I also read that Syria has also recognized them. So that's pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think it's going to be just a limited regional conflict there in the east. And the reason why the troops are being amassed also in Belarus and all along the Ukrainian border is not to allow Ukraine to move all its forces to Donbass, to the eastern Ukraine. So, yeah, it's sort of, I think it's going to take some time before things start to escalate. But already today, other decrees have been signed and put forward and confirmed by the Russian parliament. The use of force, the use of Russian armed forces beyond its borders. And yeah, this is really nothing new. These sort of things were happening already in Georgia in 2008. Someone tweeted out the comparison between the decree which Medvedev signed in 2008 and the one Putin signed yesterday. It's pretty much the same document, just
Yeah.
the names have been changed. So my guess would be that it's basically Georgia 2.0. They're going to recognize those people's republics, put some military forces in there, and just keep them there for some time. They could try to escalate. They could try to expand the area which is controlled, which is under their control and under the control of the separatists. But I think any claims of like a full-on Russian invasion of Ukraine, they're really, really overblown.
Okay.
Um, and yeah,
Why do you think I fell into this thought process, and why do you think that the the asymmetry between Russia and Ukraine is kind of overdone in the media, in the sense, I mean, obviously Russia is a major nuclear power. This hopefully at least would not be a nuclear conflict. It would be a kind of conventional 20th century like conflict. But why do you believe that myself included and other people are taking this so seriously? Are we just kind of getting ahead of ourselves, or yeah, go,
yeah,
you can go on that one.
it's partly that, and I think everyone is sort of Putin and Russia have been creating this anticipation of what's going to happen, and everyone sort of already was imagining that it will be a full-on invasion. And when something like a small thing happens, it just gets overblown because everyone is like expecting to like scream at the top of their necks, like it's happening, posting Ron
Right.
Paul memes all around the place. I think it's a part of their strategy. It's what has been doing for a long time, sort of making it out to be more than it really is. And I think, well, what did Putin do yesterday? He had a pretty long speech about Ukraine, and then he signed a couple of papers. And now, today, the next day, he's on the front cover of every newspaper in the Western world, at least. He's the top story in every evening news.
Sure.
I think that's what he wants, and that's what he got. He wants this attention. He wants to put Russia on the map. He wants that to be the main topic of discussion everywhere, and he has pretty much succeeded in doing that.
Do you think he's gotten what he wants, in the sense that, I mean, if his war aim is to prevent Ukraine from entering NATO, he has effectively achieved that. Because, I mean, there are Russian troops, it's an annexation, Russian troops are in Crimea. You now have these the Donbass regions that are kind of wild cards. Are they independent people's republics? Heavy evocations of the Soviet Union with those names. Are they independent people's republics, or are they actually, in effect, part of the Russian Federation? It seems now like bringing Ukraine into NATO is just all but impossible. And so has Putin kind of achieved his objective in that
Well,
sense?
yes and no. It depends how you look at it. First thing, those parts, eastern parts of Ukraine, have been under Russian control for 8 years.
Hmm.
And what happened yesterday is that he just made it official. Like, there was covert Russian troop movements there. There were Russian soldiers dying there. There have been pretty good investigative reports done about these funerals of Russian servicemen who just happened to die or on some exercises or some accidents that coincided with the hardest battles in that war there when the conflict was very hot in
Huh.
2014 and 2015. There also was a Russian court document that became public where some of the military contractors who were providing, well, basically catering food services to the Russian military, in there they were accused of corruption and mismanagement of funds, the usual things in Russia. But the court documents that got published actually mentioned that they were delivering food to Eastern Ukraine, to Russian servicemen in Eastern Ukraine. So there's pretty there have been a lot of evidence for the fact that Russians have been in there already for all this time, and now they just made it overt. They made it
Yeah.
official. So really, the situation on the ground has not changed because of what took place yesterday. Now it can escalate, it can move forward. But also, another point is that, again, I don't really understand where does this notion of Ukraine becoming a NATO member really come from. I mean, yes, we have the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008 where they
Right.
said that, well, we have an open door policy, and if Ukraine and Georgia would want to, well, we would sort of think about accepting them into NATO. But of course, they have to. There are plenty of standards they have to oblige by. They have to do a lot of reforms before they can do that, and this process takes a really long time. It takes, I think, it would be a minimum of 10 years, if not more, for Ukraine to become a NATO member. So I don't really see where that's coming from, but everyone is talking about it, so it has to be addressed. I don't really
And
think,
now it's 20 years off, the
yeah,
very
something
least.
like
I mean,
that,
yeah.
something like that. But the Ukrainian military, they have done significant reforms, and they're not in the state of disarray that they were 8 years ago, where they're just essentially just let Russia take Crimea, and it took them a couple of months before regrouping and starting to hold off territories to hold the contact line in the east. So the Ukrainian military now is not the one they had in 8 years ago. So their military has become much stronger. They have experience. They have weapons. They have everything. But of course, their technological forces, like their air forces, their armaments, their armed vehicles, and things like that, they don't really they can't really fight Russia now, like in a full-scale war, but they could certainly do a lot of damage. And I think Putin is very much not interested in having Russian body bags returning home from Ukraine. That would like
Right.
destroy his ratings, and Russia would become pretty anti-Putin then, because
Or
war is
or
something which was something what Russians take very seriously.
yeah. Or would it entirely? I mean, let let me talk to you about my conception of this, and you can respond and say if I'm off or so on. Um, a lot of people, and I've seen this particularly among the dissident right or whatever, but you even see this among people like Tucker Carlson and so on. They want to blame everything on America, and it's kind of like, well, there's this NATO expansion. We're provoking the bear. We're recklessly expanding NATO, and this is going to elicit a response. I think there's obviously a lot of truth to that. There are more than one kernel of truth to that statement. NATO is a has been expanding since its inception, and it has even been expanding since the end of the Cold War, and it is getting closer to Russia's borders. So whether you agree with Putin or not, his position on his kind of conspiratorial position on NATO is understandable. I can see why he thinks that. At the same time, I think it's wrong to say that Putin himself doesn't want this kind of East West division. And even if it entails, getting kicked off the SWIFT system, Russia has its own, alternative SWIFT system. SWIFT is a way of sending international transactions. I've used it a number of times. Um, and it's based in Belgium, I believe. But he like it would create a lot of pain. Nord Stream getting delayed, quasi canceled by the Germans. It's now in a state of ambiguity. He doesn't want these things exactly, but he's more than willing to tolerate these kinds of sanctions and economic and cultural retaliations by Europe and the United States. And in fact, Putin's conception of Russia is as a Russian sphere that is divided from the West. And whether you think about that in terms of the Russian Empire or even like a Catholic Orthodox divide, or what have you, or the eastern half of the Roman Empire, perhaps. I mean, these divisions go back a very long way, and Putin wants that division. He's eager for a neo Cold War to take place. Now, it will absolutely lead to hardship and in suffering for Russians, but he is more than willing to tolerate that if the lines of the Russian sphere are delineated. And I've noticed on my feed some like discussion of empire and imperialism, and I see a lot of basically pro-Russian hacks or shills who want to basically say, no, it's only the West that's imperial, because the West brings about a this terrible economic system of neoliberalism and so on, and that's imperialism. It seems to be a kind of shell game that they're playing. The fact is, both the West and the East have a form of imperialism. Putin's imperialism is an older style notion of a Russian sphere that is centralized to a strong degree, federalized to also a degree, but is basically a clear zone that is apart from the West. Now, I would agree that neoliberalism and the global economy and even something like SWIFT in its way is a kind of form of imperialism, a different form. Maybe this is a kind of land versus sea battle, if you want to bring up Carl Schmitt's famous distinction between those two types of empires. But that's what we are seeing. So Putin, well, I guess the gist of what I'm saying is that on some level, Putin likes the sanctions. It makes everything clear to him. We've gone out of this, end of the Cold War period, say the 10 years after 1989, 1991, where Russia was being transformed, it was being humiliated, And it was a economic and humanitarian catastrophe. We've ended that. We are reverting to big power block politics, and is more it's okay if there is some suffering and economic hardship along the way, so long as the Russian sphere is reestablished and there's no more ambiguity. There's no more like we're one world or Russia is part of the West or what have you. He would much rather just secure power, and he's willing to take his lumps along the way. What do you think about that general conception of things?
Yeah, I would agree that Putin is someone who has deep nostalgia for the Soviet Union, and he sort of wants to like live a version of the Cold War, but where he sort of doesn't make the same mistakes which the Soviet leaders did
Right.
make. But at the same time, I think it's very sort of the question of political change is something that I think Westerners, and more particularly Americans and Anglos, they sort of have this very sort of almost sort of inherent psychological inability to understand political change. I don't really think that what happened to Russia in the 90s was all that terrible what it's made out to be. I mean,
Okay.
the same thing happened here where I live, in the Baltics. This process of transformation, and of course, when one political and economic system fails, there is this transitional period, and it is hard. It has a lot of hardship in there, but eventually you sort of adapt, and everything levels out, and it's really not that bad at the end of the day. I actually have a couple of books by Patrick Buchanan in my bookshelf.
Mm-hmm.
And he sort of, and I also read his blog recently. He always takes this position. Well, we could call it this sort of old Cold Warrior turned Russian patriot type of position, which I think Tucker Carlson also talks about,
Yeah.
where you look at Russia and you sort of imagine it as being this. You sort of think about Russia in Cold War terms. And one of the main things there is that, well, Russia used to be evil and communist and godless, but now Russia is Orthodox, Christian, and trad, and blah blah blah. And it's somehow they think it's a completely different country, but I would actually argue that it's pretty much the same country because, especially under Putin, the sort of the political regime is sort of reverting back to the old Soviet style of governing. They have this one person, Putin, which is in the center of everything. He has this one ruling party, which is pretty much the ruling party like the Communist Party once was. The other parties, which are in the Russian parliament, are basically controlled opposition. And it's pretty much the same. And I mean, from far away, you may think that, well, at least they're not communists, right? But in every other facet, they're pretty much the same. And
Mm-hmm.
there's also this thing about color revolutions and political change happening. Well, having these popular uprisings. When well, there was this. A number of uprisings during the Cold War, like the 56 uprising in Hungary, the 68 in Czechoslovakia,
Yeah.
and then we had the the peaceful revolutions against communism in the 80s. Well, you could call those color revolutions as well, but this process is just ongoing. It didn't happen then when the Soviet Union collapsed in places like Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine. It happened later. And now it's sort of seen as like evil and funded by the CIA or whatever. But it's definitely organic, and it's definitely just a popular uprising against what they see as a corrupt and old system, which they would like to change.
Yeah.
And Putin, what he's doing, he's just using force, military force, because he really has no other type of assets he could use. I mean, Russia doesn't have economic power, it doesn't have like soft power, cultural power. Well, I would argue that it actually does a bit, but not the same as the West, and certainly not strong enough to like hold everything together as it once was. So he has to use like this last resort, which is military force, to keep it all together. And it's also a generational thing. I think all these leaders, Russian leaders now, they're in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. And once there is a generational change in Russian leadership, I think these things will sort of even out. But until then, it's really hard to say. It's just I think it's just going to go on. Russia doesn't have it has a strong military. It has a strong it's one of the nuclear superpowers. But
Sure.
what he can do is just take these little pieces of these countries, like chip them away and declare them being sovereign and independent or something, having control of those regions. That's all he can do. I don't think there's some march to the River Elbe or something like that. It's just impossible. And again,
Mm.
just for the sake of argument, we could just say that, well, what if he gets what he wants? What if, like, the former Warsaw Pact, like the half of Europe is under Russian control again? How long will it last? The post World War II order in Europe, with Soviets controlling half of Europe, it lasted for almost 50 years.
Yeah.
How long could Russia hold this? Being having an overextended military presence, having these sanctions everywhere, um, I think it would implode in pretty short time.
And
I mean, maybe.
it lacks the ideological punch of the Soviet Union in the sense that, you know, the Soviet Union would present itself plausibly as the next great step in world history, as, you know, inevitable, basically. And yeah, that started to fade by the 1970s, and there was a by the late 60s, a lot of the Western left was kind of anti-Soviet and so on, and third worldism, etc. But nevertheless, the Soviet Union had that power. I just don't see like Russian culture as, you know, come and join orthodoxy and alcoholism or something as like some force that's going to attract the great minds of a generation or something.
Yeah,
I mean, it just, I mean, again, I am, you know, I have a lot of sympathy for Russian culture and so on, but it's, it just is going to strike most intellectuals as backward. And it isn't really this like pure trad society or something. I think that's largely a fantasy.
yeah, it
And
is.
even if it weren't a fantasy, I don't think that is actually going to you know, be all that compelling. All
Yeah,
right.
but
Oh yeah. Yeah, if you want to add to that, we could bring in some of these people who want to ask some questions. But do you want to add to that, or finish your thought?
yeah, again, I think that what happened yesterday is not really a win for Russia. Um, First of all, they can no longer claim that they're not involved in Eastern Ukraine. And I think it would have been better for Russia and Putin to just continue this diplomatic long game and pretending not to be the aggressor. But I
Hmm.
think they sort of got tired of it. And they also were trying to, I think, couple of days before yesterday, I think on Sundays, Face the Nation and some other programs, they had Russian ambassadors on, and they actually said that, well, we recognize the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and that what happens in eastern Ukraine is their internal matter, something like that. And then yesterday, there's a complete 180. Um, yeah, I don't really think it's been really thought through on the part of Russians. But yeah, we just have to wait and see what happens. There will definitely
Well,
be military
couldn't you say that
escalation.
those guys are just like they're saying the script from last week and not the new script? Like they don't
Yeah, yeah,
know
it's
the
something
new
like that.
party line, but it
There
actually
actually,
is a
there actually
really strong
was
advancement.
there actually was a little glimpse of something going wrong in that yesterday's Russia's Security Council gathering that they had. The chief of the Russian intelligence agency, sort of misspoke, and he was very nervous. And Putin
I saw this.
was pressing him, and he sort of said that, well, yes, I agree that we should add these people's republics to the Russian Federation, and I'm for this notion. And then Putin corrected him and said that, well, this is not what we're discussing today, or something. It's
So
weird.
clearly, that's what they want to do. I
And it
mean,
was,
don't you
but
think
the
in the
thing
next
is, it wasn't
year?
live. It wasn't live. It was pre-recorded. I mean, they could have
Oh,
cut it
interesting.
out for some reason, but it was pre-recorded, and they kept it in there. So, I mean, that's something for Kremlinologists to discuss. I think we're sort of trying to do that now,
Yeah.
sort of Kremlinology, what's going on in there. But yeah, I think they would want to do that, but they already kind of did it with Crimea, and it sort of didn't work out the way they wanted to, or maybe it did. But it's pretty much hard to predict what's going to happen next. But I don't think that I'm absolutely sure that there will not be a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That I'm
Okay.
almost certain of.
Well, we will see. Um,
Yeah,
I'm fine with being wrong. I just I want to conceive of the situation rationally and realistically, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But yeah, I might be. I might maybe I'm reading too much into it or something, or seeing it as like a logical. It does seem to be just the logical implication of what was said. To give myself a little credit, it's just you can't say these things and there not be consequences to them. It would be like, I mean, if Joe Biden went and said, Canada, we should remember that Canada is a nation of traitors. These are the people who chose the side of the King George III as opposed to American independence. And, you know, have they ever, are they really sovereign? They just go along with, America and Britain and in these world wars. They're our bitch. And, maybe we should just make everything clear and end fake Canada and bring about the true America is as a continental state. I mean, if he said that, I mean, people would be spitting their coffee in midair and shaking in their boots and freaking out justifiably. I mean, it just the logical implication of disrespecting someone's sovereignty on some basic level is that you are going to take them over. Like you aren't real. We're dehumanizing you in some way. If there's a phrase for that for a state, like destatifying a state. I mean, it just seems very significant. And again, maybe I'm reading too much into it. We'll see. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong.
yeah, but this is something that has been going on for a long time now, and
Yeah.
these remarks, which were said yesterday, it really wasn't anything new. So yeah, that's where I'll gonna leave it at. So yeah,
Okay.
let some others in.
All right. Well, I will let everyone in, and then I will recognize you. I will recognize your sovereignty, and you can speak. So let's start with Boris Vesev. I remember we spoke a couple weeks ago. I think he is a Russian in the West, so I'm very curious about his perspective.
Yes. Hi, Richard. Hi, everybody. I agree with both. your assessments of what's going on there, and I also do not believe that a full-scale invasion is likely as the next step, even though it's it's a possibility. One nuance that was largely missed, even though it's pretty recent, in today's ratification or whatever the process is called there. The Duma took yesterday's decision by Putin to recognize those two entities, and the question was, how do you define them in terms of territory? Because the two entities take up about a quarter of the territory of the two Ukrainian regions, Donetsk and Lugansk. So apparently the Duma voted today to recognize them within the entire territory of those two regions, which is 4 times the kind of the territory of the factual zone, which opens up a large city of Mariupol, basically, that authorizes Russia to take it if they chose to, and be backed up by that decision by the Duma. Also, a little remark on your earlier point, Richard, about the prepositional use for on and in.
Right.
Yeah. What was the kind of the rule back in the Soviet days? They used to refer to whenever they spoke of Ukraine, they used the on preposition, and it was kind of, nobody really gave it much thought. Why is that? Because in every other republic or any other country, you would use the in. It would be logical. It just so happened that everyone was using on. And then when Ukraine became independent, they adopted the in preposition, because that kind of, the reasoning was that, it fully reflects the independent sovereign nature of the country, whereas the Russians continued to use the on preposition as if trying to kind of underscore the fact that they don't believe it's a real sovereign entity. One of the largest questions in my mind, and some of the others that I've read and heard about the topic, was, in general, what if you were in Putin's shoes? You have been incredibly lucky with the prices of natural resources, with the electorate that he was able to basically force into a deal over the last 20 years since he's been president. And the deal was this: you basically, I will ensure economic growth, and I will ensure continuous improvement of your living standards in exchange for you, meaning the citizenry, giving up your ability to influence political events, governance, and everything else. And for the first 10 years, it was both sides of the bargains were upheld. There was economic growth. People were happy and didn't care much if the government was becoming less and less accountable. And right around the time of, it kind of started in 2008, 2009, and there was an uptick for 3 or 4 years after that. But in 2014, when the first serious sanctions were introduced after the Crimea, and the kind of the standard of living part of the bargain was no longer there. And that's probably when there was some notion that Putin had to replace it with something else. And that something else, increasingly, apparently in his head, that concept was formed as kind of, I am the restorer of traditional Russian lands. I'm the gatherer of the historic Russian lands. And it was at first not dramatic, and then kind of the fast forward to late last year, Putin got into a brinkmanship game. First with the NATO, then with I'm not sure if the sequence is correct, but basically the European Union and NATO, and basically it was one demand after another, and they were all rebuked, and basically he didn't get anything as far as enlargement of NATO and acceptance of Ukraine into the EU and others. Basically, they refused to say that they would never do it. And what probably led to the current situation is Putin he couldn't just walk away from it and kind of say, okay, well, I tried and I didn't get anywhere. He had to have some win. And over the years, he has watched the West waver and compromise and look the other way every time he did something it was nothing big, so it was easy for the Western countries in question, especially Germany, to basically justify, oh, we don't want to provoke him, we want to maintain trade and all that stuff. So he pushed harder and harder and harder, and at some point, probably late December, he said, okay, I'm gonna make a more dramatic move and see how they react. And since then, he has incrementally been doing this. To Biden's credit and to the credit of some of the European leaders, they figured that game and they tried to be one step ahead of it. Hence the announcements of the dates of invasion, which was first to be on April 16th, then April 20th, now April 22nd. That's why Biden speaks and says, okay, I have incontrovertible intelligence that Putin's planning a full-blown invasion on such and such date. And people make fun of it, say, well, he's an idiot, and blah, blah, blah. But in fact, I am positive that there's a large amount of intelligence available through basic, just spying on people's cell phone conversations. It's not difficult to gather right now, given the generally chaotic nature of, people ascribe to Putin this extremely effective and very strict, very kind of closed system that he runs. It's very far from the truth.
I would quickly add in there. I do think that Biden might have learned a certain lesson from Afghanistan, in the sense that they were seeing the world through rose-colored glasses before what was it, August of last year, and they just, again, whether you support withdrawing or not, and most people do ultimately support withdrawing, it looked terrible, it looked chaotic, they looked like incompetent fools. However, if he had simply gotten out ahead of the situation and, given a somber speech to the American, media, just saying, this is going to be bad, we've got to prepare ourselves for some, unintended consequences of all this. It seems like if he had kind of gotten out ahead of the matter and set expectations, it would have been better. I think he is kind of desperately doing that. And also because there's this natural kind of back and forth between the parties, where if Putin gets a big win in Ukraine, then all of the Republicans are going to drop their pro-Russia stuff and basically say, who lost Ukraine? It was Biden, weak leadership. You can see this, you can see them doing this as we speak.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I think Biden was actually being, deft and in just kind of getting out in front, setting expectations. And, again, he said, he expects a full invasion. He has not been, he's been off a bit on the dates, but he clearly is not entirely wrong. I mean, things are advancing. Whether I'm overstating matters or whether Master Sheikh is understating matters, we both agree that this is the train is going down the tracks on this.
Oh, totally agree with it. And actually, what's interesting is the first announced date of invasion was February 16th, and on the night of February 15th, there was a massive DDoS attack on the Ukrainian government and banks.
Interesting.
Whether it lasted until kind of the wee hours of the morning, and it kind of withered away. But nobody knows whether this was just one branch of the kind of invading force that didn't get the memo on time, or whether it was just decided that all of a sudden they were outed. As they say, the demon that's been outed is only half strong. So by announcing the date of invasion ahead of the invasion, who knows whether it was planned for those dates or not. But if it was, if you were in Putin's shoes, you probably wouldn't invade on the date that Biden had announced a day before or 2 days before. So
unless you were very bold.
Yeah, exactly. So one other kind of a point that I wanted to make is arguably the recognition of those two enclaves is actually a good thing for the Ukraine, because it puts an end to the Minsk Accord nonsense. The Minsk Accord nonsense was basically designed to push those areas into the Ukraine and basically recognize them as legitimate within the Ukraine and give them autonomy that no other areas in the Ukraine have. And basically having a Russian controlled hostile enclave within the Ukraine and having full access to Ukrainian legislature and resources, and basically enable it to destroy the country from within. Now, nobody can force Ukraine to go along with that nonsense and pretend like they have to. I mean, Ukraine is kind of compromised there because they feel that they need to listen to the Europeans and the Americans, who are kind of on their side, but at the same time they've been pushing them into a very dangerous down a very dangerous path, and now that pretense is gone. So for them to formally recognize the breakaway regions now, after Russia has recognized them, it's kind of a contrarian view. But if Ukraine recognized them as well and basically drew its borders around them and said, okay, we move on, you guys do whatever you want, let Russia worry about the highly economically depressed and dysfunctional population there, that actually clears, at least in a formal sense, it clears the path for Ukraine to join NATO, because it no longer has a disputed territory within its borders, and it no longer has foreign soldiers on its soil.
I think this is, I see where you're going with this, and it's very, I actually tend to agree with your logic. I mean, what do you think about this, Master Sheikh? So we both operate under the assumption that Ukraine simply can't join NATO with, Crimea being annexed and these ambiguous breakaway autonomous republics, but if Kiev kind of turns the table on them and just recognizes those republics as autonomous and maybe part of, maybe even part of the Russian Federation, who knows, that they can then just say, all right, we do have these strict borders. We've effectively kicked out all the eastern half, the pro-Russian speakers, and we're now ready to join NATO.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree. I agree about the Minsk Accords being basically useless and a nuisance to Ukraine. But I think that at least some months ago, at the end of the last year, there was actually this ongoing campaign from the United States as well, not only from Russia, to like force Ukraine into implementing the Minsk Accords. So, and that would be very bad for Ukraine. But now this problem has sort of solved itself on its own. But another point about these dates of something happening or an invasion happening, I think when we last spoke last month, I predicted that there will be no action taken until the end of the Olympics, and it turns out I was right. I think tweeted out some things, so I have some evidence about that.
Yes.
The reason why I said that is that the last time uh, Russia did this, well, it revolves around the Olympics actually. The 2008 Olympics were on 888, hosted by China, and the Russian attack on Georgian forces happened then, on the night of the opening ceremony. And the word is that I've read some commentators saying that China was actually very furious at Russia because all the media was talking about the Russian invasion of Georgia instead of talking about the Olympic Games in China. And the sea, I guess, has warned Putin not to do anything in Ukraine until the end of the Olympics. So he sort of kept this thing. Um, Another thing about Russian speakers, so-called Russian speakers, I don't really like this terminology because the eastern part of Ukraine, this separatist-controlled regions, they're just a tiny, tiny part of Ukraine, and actually, the second largest city in Ukraine, Kharkiv, is also majority Russian speaking, and at least at the beginning of this month, there were massive pro-Ukrainian rallies held there with people marching in the streets with Ukrainian flags and saying, "We're Ukraine, we're Ukraine." And
Huh.
also, the majority of the Ukrainian servicemen who have fought on the line of contact against these separatists come from these surrounding areas, which are deeper in westwards from this eastern part, which is also Russian speaking. So this notion of Russia protecting it's like these ethnic Russians or Russian speakers is completely false. The thing that a lot of people in the West, especially people like Tucker Carlson, get wrong is that the language you speak does not necessarily mean your allegiances. So Russians, if someone happens just to have their first language as Russian, or they use Russian at home speaking with their family, doesn't mean that they're automatically pro-Russia and pro-Putin. That's a very important point, which I think a lot of people don't really get.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree. And not only Kharkiv actually, I've heard the same reports that it took a pretty hard turn toward being pro-Ukraine versus maybe 3-4 years ago when it was largely seen as an easy city for the Russians to claim as their own. Kiev, until not long ago, was 60% Russian speakers. I mean, I've been to Kiev numerous times, and I hardly ever heard Ukrainian speech there. It's pretty much a larger. Odessa is another one. Odessa is entirely Russian, even though they don't see themselves as part of Russia. I mean, it was always kind of almost like a separate city state.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's much more complex than just being ethnic Russian versus ethnic Ukrainian. It's been intermarried. I mean, a lot of people have intermarried there. Nobody really knows, what percentage of your blood is Russian, what percentage of your blood is Ukrainian. In addition, there's also no unity on that subject by far in Russia itself. Over 30 million families in Russia have family connections in Ukraine, have family members or came from Ukraine or kind of trace their lineage to Ukraine. So Putin is not looking at kind of his agenda with regard to delegitimizing Ukraine as a sovereign nation as kind of a slam dunk domestically, and hence you see the trepidation of his inner circle that could be observed in that Security Council meeting, where people were they were squirming like snakes on a skillet, basically, when Putin pressed them to say yes, I support it. Many compared it to some of the gatherings of the communist Politburo under Stalin, where Stalin had to taint. He didn't want to take responsibility for some of the stuff he did. So whenever there was a list of people to be executed or imprisoned, he would gather, at least high-profile people. He would gather his inner circle and have them publicly support it and put their names, and some actually went as far as kill like a dog. I mean, they would sign a resolution of whatever that either Politburo or a broader gathering that decided those matters, and the kind of the parallels were pretty striking. Putin clearly was not comfortable accepting his individual responsibility for what he was going to do, so he had to taint a bunch of other people and make sure that they don't have a way to avoid it, and they don't have, and therefore, to ensure their loyalty, because they're all of a sudden in the same boat, they cannot say we had nothing to do with it.
Right.
So,
thanks, Boris. You can stay on as a speaker, and you can add if you'd like. I'm going to let some other people get their thoughts in. So I'll go with Nikopol first, and then I'll go to Brendan, and then Mittal, I guess, and then Abdullah. So Nikopol, you have the floor.
Oh, all right. Thanks. Hi, Richard. Hi, Czech.
Hi.
Well, I was listening to Czech. I think Boris made quite a lot of good points, and I was on board with what Czech is saying until about a week ago. And currently, I'm not, and especially because of that. Not that speech. I mean, that speech was kind of a weird, but for the people who been listening to Putin for some years, nothing really that much new came on. He has been denying kind of a Ukrainian statehood all the way back to mid-2000s. It's kind of a popular theme among those circles of his people who used to be like in a security service of the Soviet Union and others like that. So that's not really that new, even though tone was much harsher than it was ever before. But especially, as Boris mentioned, that National Security Council meeting, because Czech was saying that the guy who is the head of Foreign Intelligence Service was nervous. I watched that tape a couple of times, and I don't think he was nervous. I think he was scared shitless. Like, the guy legitimately looked scared. He was mumbling. He didn't know what to say. He looked really afraid, and Putin was just badgering him. He was humiliating him. And this wasn't live television. This was pre-recorded. Yeah. They had parts cut off. They could have recorded it over. They could have told him, like, okay, calm down, go outside, have a smoke, come back in, read the damn script. They didn't do that. They let one of the most senior security official in the country be humiliated on the television, which was then aired on every single Russian state TV.
Wow.
And you could see also other people who you would kind of assume are the inner circle, and none of them look comfortable. Like, the people who were the most hawkish and who was most cheering for it was former President and Prime Minister Medvedev, who doesn't really matter that much in last 8 or something like years. As a Prime Minister, after he was President, he was a Prime Minister. He basically acted as a fall guy. Anything went wrong in Russia, economy, social services, whatever, it was always blamed on him, so that Putin doesn't have to be blamed. So that was kind of one of his big roles. So that's obviously not he was in the polls, he was generally really unpopular, while Putin was popular because what went right was a success of Vladimir Putin. What went wrong was a failure of Dmitry Medvedev. That was kind of presented. So his popularity ranking was quite low. I think last time there was something like 25, was pathetic percentage like that, while Putin is generally keeping above 65, 70 to 80 at heights. And also the other people, you had like Minister of Interior, who is not really seen as the closest in the inner security circle, and people like that who, they matter, but they don't matter as much as director of the FSB, on people like that from the military. Now, none of them looked as bad as the director of the Foreign Intelligence Service, but they really didn't look like they wanted to be there. It seems like it kind of felt like in their eyes, they know exactly what's going to happen, and they don't know what to do. It seems, maybe just kind of a reading, it seems like basically Putin has made his decision, and you're going to follow or you're going to fall out. And so every single one of them had to follow. And even before, because what I kind of expected is all build up and exercise in Belarus and everything it looked like a pressure tactic. And it was something that most people in Russia kind of also knew. Like when you look at the journalists, Western journalists in Moscow and in Russia, they have their own sources close to Kremlin, but virtually every single one of them comes from kind of a business sector. When it comes to security sector, unless you're a spy or something, they don't talk. Like they know better than to talk. So the journalists are kind of getting information about what's going on behind the scenes, these often vague statements from the business people. And the business people have been telling them for quite a while, like they are not asking us for anything. We don't even matter anymore. It's basically Putin surrounded himself with close circle, some of people who are there for decades, who helped him to propel into the power. In the 90s, he was first, after he left the KGB, he worked for the Petersburg mayor. And from then he went to Yeltsin administration. He became the prime minister. And from there, he became the president. And of course, this was not a simple path. He had a lot of security officials, former KGB, also the business interests like Khodorkovsky and others who were helping him to get to that point to become a president. So a lot of people from his circle are from that era. Some are kind of new, but no one is super new there. And it just, there's no information leaking out at all. So even the the journalists are kind of missing it. Anyway, the point is that they've been convinced until not a couple of days ago that this is what is going on, that Putin is playing his game, he's putting pressure on the West, and that in their opinion, he's trying to West make scared, so they will accept some kind of a concessions that normally they would not accept. And that seems to be going that way because you had Germans and you had the French pressuring a Ukrainian president to actually implement the Minsk Accords, which he didn't want to implement. And suddenly, basically, within span of couple of days, the front line around the Donbass, which was mostly quiet, there were some violations, but nothing really that serious, no casualties, just went all up in blaze, like massive shelling, propaganda, which was about as fake as you can imagine. Like it was laughable how bad it was. It was obvious they didn't even care at that point. And immediately after that, suddenly Putin is talking about genocide. But this is the word he didn't use. Like he kind of used it in 2014, but you know, it makes sense during that time there was a hot war going on. But ever since he dropped it from his dictionary, suddenly he's using it. Next thing you have just escalations and recognitions of these two republics, which happened yesterday. The problem is it doesn't solve anything at all for him. Like he could have recognized him and basically military annexed him any time over the day during the last 8 years. And no one could do anything about it. Like there would be no one who will go to confrontation with the Russian army there. Absolutely no one. He never, there's no reason to stop now because right now he has achieved absolutely nothing that he couldn't have achieved in the past. But unlike in the past, he now has 120, 130, maybe 160,000 troops stationed, all basically from the Poland all the way to Romania around the Ukraine. Like we are talking Black Sea, Russia, Belarus. Up to that, it seems like he's not listening to anyone. And that kind of a thing I fear is his age. Putin he's going to be in a couple of months 70 years old. He's not a young man anymore. He's been in the presidency de facto for 23 years now, if I think correctly. And he's been changing kind of gradually ever since. Like 2000s, Putin was this business-oriented friend of West who wants to help West fight Islamic terrorism and the wars in the Middle East, while also reinvigorating the economy. Sorry?
Can I ask a quick
Sure,
question?
you've been raising your hand. Do you have yeah, jump in.
Yeah.
Sure.
Why should we trust Duginists like you? Like you are very close with.
All right. Goodbye.
I don't understand.
Yeah, I'm apparently a Duginist. You shouldn't trust me. As you can tell, I'm just really in the what is it, in the can for in the tank for Russia. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead, Nikopol.
I'll try to make it short because don't worry about me. Just stop me if you think I'm blabbering way too much.
Well,
sometimes
I found you've given a lot of really good background information. I found it fascinating, so you can keep going.
Yeah, what I was going to, it's 2000s, as Putin was, we all kind of remember those times as, even in Hollywood, you heard all that we're going to be friends with Russia and so on. That was kind of the mindset. No one wanted to go deal, like you still had these hawks in Washington, of course in Eastern Europe, but not really in Germany, not really in Paris, in London, some. It was kind of no one cared. There was basically no presence of NATO troops in Poland or Baltics or Slovakia or Romania or what have you. And this, of course, changed quite drastically, not even after 2008, the Georgian War. Right after the Georgian War, you had the Obama reset, right? It happened in 2014. And I think there's one thing, like everyone forgot about this, that it existed. It still kind of exists on the paper. But back then, Putin was trying to create what he called the Eurasian Union, which was supposed to be like a Russian answer to the European Union. And it was supposed to collect like the entire post-Soviet world, Central Asia, South Caucasus, and also Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, to its own kind of a sphere of economical orbit, soft security, and so on. However, the key for him was always kind of the Ukraine. And the revolution in Ukraine happened because back then the president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, he was facing a choice between accepting this deal with the European Union and thus link himself economically with the EU, or with the Eurasian Union, so with the Russian Federation. And eventually he went for the former. And then you had the massive protests, the violence, death, so on. Eventually it ended him going away, and immediately new government signing the European Union deal. And ever since that Eurasian Union idea just went out, just no one even heard about it. Just kind of sometimes appears in the news, but I wouldn't blame you if you completely forgot about it and didn't think about it for the last 8 years.
Right.
So ever since, you could kind of see him gradually going more and more to, I don't want to go because I think it's stupid to just go saying about he wants to have a Soviet Union again. That's not really what he is. Even his last speech, you could hear quite vividly that he's not really admirer of Soviet Union, he's admirer of the old Russian Empire. Yeah. So it's not about Soviet Union, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. And you could see that he was gradually moving more to militarization. After that, the Russian army went through a massive stage of modernization of their armies. They changed from the brigade-based combat units to what we currently see, the BTGs, battle tactical groups, which are smaller but more mobile. You see massive procurement of the new weaponry, development of new armored personnel vehicles, uniforms, tanks, what have you, even the jets, which was overseen by the Sergei Shoigu, who is the long-time defense minister and Putin's one of the first allies. And it's been gradually escalating towards the kind of a soft armed intervention. You had the one in Syria, but it was only the Air Force. But eventually, I think what kind of happened is a year ago, you had a similar buildup. It wasn't this big. It was maybe 2/3 of what we have today. And basically nothing happened. Just he was back then trying to kind of push the Minsk and push these things to go around. And perhaps, because obviously I don't see in his head, perhaps he thought that this will be enough to scare the West. And the West basically just completely ignored it. The West was just dealing with COVID, with this, with that. There was some kind of a diplomatic statements and some articles, but before you knew it, it just disappeared from the front pages, and Putin achieved absolutely nothing. And because you cannot have these soldiers from Far East, close to Japan or South Caucasus, you still need troops in those regions. You cannot have permanently just move them to the West and leave them here in tents in the middle of a mud. He just withdrew them. And it didn't like resonate in the West, because I don't think West was trying to humiliate it. Him just didn't kind of care. It had bigger problems to deal with, but that may not have been the perception in Russia. I think what perception in Russia and Putin's own circle could have been was one of humiliation. And you had then incidents happening in the Black Sea. The most famous one was when the British frigate basically sailed into Crimean territorial waters. It just declared that because United Kingdom doesn't recognize Crimea as part of Russia, these are Ukrainian territorial waters and they have permission to enter Ukraine territorial waters. And also this didn't make that big of a news, but it also did make news back in Russia, because that frigate basically just went there and they didn't do anything about it. And the frigate eventually just left, because what is it supposed to be doing there? So you had these kind of things just going on, and also the development of the missile systems in the Ukraine, which they were very proud of. They managed to develop their own anti-ship ballistic missile, and they are developing their own land-based ballistic missiles. They were demonstrating it basically only a few months ago and were pushing into the service. It could have been that from the Putin perspective, and again, complete speculation, is he saw this as being just humiliated, not taken seriously. And that basically West is seeing Russia as just kind of a minor power that it has to pat on the back from time to time to get it to shut up and just move on to his own things. So it's possible that he just decided at his age, when he's maybe thinking about the legacy, about what he will leave behind and how will people in Russia after his death remember him as a president. It could have been that he made a decision that he's just going to basically flip the entire European kind of an order up on his head. Like it seems like happening. And if that's the case, and given how scared and nervous and uncomfortable all those people in the Security Council look like, especially the chief of the Foreign Intelligence Service, like he's been known as a hawk. He hasn't been known as a moderate guy. And he looks scared there. It seems like he just decided he's just going to go for it, as he's nearly 70. How long does he have? Maybe 10 more years in power, and that's it.
Yeah.
And that he's gonna basically write his name into annals of the Russian history, just as great emperors and other people who are being taught in grade school to Russian kids are. And in that case, if that's to happen, it's possible that all these calculations about how many Ukrainian soldiers are there, how much damage it will bring, what will happen, all these blowbacks, that he just got to the point that he doesn't even care that much. What does it matter for him how the economy will look like in 30 years? He will be dead in 30 years. Maybe he cares about what will happen now and how what will happen now will reflect into the future. Economy is, in history, easily forgotten. Military conquests, setting of the spheres of influence, these great leaders who are feared and respected throughout the entire world, these are not forgotten. So maybe that's where he is. Maybe it's not irrational, maybe just his logic. Also, because his security circle and others, they do give interviews to Russian outlets. That theme is kind of the same, is that the Western is falling because it's inherently tied itself with a liberalism, which is kind of rotting it from the inside. It's divided, it's fighting among each other, and thus we don't see it as much of a threat as we did anymore. So maybe just trying to, at the heydays, even though we are talking 10 years, but from the position of someone who is 70 and who is looking at the end of his life, maybe that may be like, this is either we strike now or I just go down into annals of history of good president, maybe great president, but who eventually didn't really change that much of anything. So that's my kind of a calculation. And what we're seeing right now is what he has done with the Donetsk and Luhansk. He doesn't achieve anything. So why would he stop there? And if he doesn't stop, what happens? He goes, okay, for the rest of these regions, because only 1/3 are occupied by the separatists. All right, he conquers those regions. What then? Those regions aren't really important. These towns, smaller and maybe medium size, they are not economically active. A lot of people don't like him there. there will be a lot of people, a lot of soldiers will be coming home in coffins. It will not be popular in Russia when the sons and fathers and others are suddenly being received in Russia dead. This will not be so. And for what? For area that used to be rich, but that's long time in the past. So that leaves only one other option. It's complete, basically, occupation of Ukraine and government change. And maybe he just decided that whatever price has to be paid, and down the line he will just simply get a better deal.
Yeah, what you're saying, you've added a lot more nuance than I did, but what you're saying really aligns with what I was suggesting. That I get the kind of long-term quality that Master Sheikh was bringing out, but it does feel like a Rubicon has been crossed, and that in some ways, like, all of these things that were ambiguous over the last 25 years are going to no longer be ambiguous. And it's just like, let's just bring this, let's make everything clear. Let's get all the lines down straight. And, those sanctions can go away in 15 or 20 years. People will forget about them, or they'll adjust to the new status quo. But yeah, no, very, very good stuff that you added. Thanks for that. Okay, let's go. Brendan, do you want to jump in? Been waiting patiently.
Hi, Richard.
Hi.
Obviously not an expert, and there's a lot of good stuff already mentioned, but with regards to the American right, which is in love with Putin even more than probably his inner circle, it seems. Tucker also probably loves Putin more than the intelligence service chief that Putin was grilling. But it seems like they don't understand Putin's mindset. They think he's a white savior. They won't say it, but I think that's why they like him. But I put up a tweet in this Twitter space. You can scroll to the top of the profiles, and you'll see the first one. I posted a quote from a very racially aware quote from Obama and Biden's ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. And he wrote an article in the Washington Post, an opinion piece, that Vladimir Putin does not think like we do. And the quote that I posted from McFaul was that they had a meeting with Putin in person. And at one point, he writes, Putin told Biden to his face, he's paraphrasing, that Putin said, "You look at us and you see our skin and then assume we think like you, but we don't." To emphasize his point, Putin slid his index finger down his white cheek. And this is something that the liberals in DC understand as a viewpoint from Putin, and yet his idiot fanboys in the United States think he's somehow fighting the decadent West on behalf of some greater vision, when he's just really cares about Russians more than anything. And his main concern is the West as a threat to Russia. It's not like he's an alternative.
Save the West. Yeah. No, let me jump in real quick, because this is almost a reversal of a situation that occurred with was it Brezhnev and Margaret Thatcher? I will go look this up. Now, it was relayed in a book, and so there's no strong evidence that this actually happened. But the notion that this person just made up this anecdote also isn't very plausible. This seems to align. So I believe it was Brezhnev was with Margaret Thatcher, and at one point he grabbed her by the hand and he said, "Look, East-West, communism, capitalism, the real issue is whether the white race is going to survive." And so he said this to her in this very genuine and urgent manner. And supposedly Margaret Thatcher was baffled by this notion that he was putting forth. It's fascinating. I need to go find that. It was in a it was a published anecdote. Again, you can disbelieve it or not. It just seems to ring true, on both sides, actually, particularly with Margaret Thatcher being baffled. But it's fascinating that Putin has this just totally different conception, and he almost it's like a mirror image of what Brezhnev did. I agree. I understand. I mean, I have obviously a certain respect for Putin. I try to at least understand him, but there is this sense that we look at the Western clown world and we're just like, what a joke. This is too liberal. There's transsexuals everywhere, blah, blah, blah. And then you see Putin as like he's going to save the white race. The problem is that there are geopolitical factors that override any kind of, West or white unity between East and West, at least from Putin's mind. Now, if there's a different leader, then different things are possible. But in Putin's mind, he wants to weaken the West. And so I agree, of course, that the Russiagate stuff was overdone, and that, Keith Olbermann claiming that, Donald Trump is an agent of the Russian Empire. So obviously, that is absurd. That being said, it's based on fact. I mean, the fact is there is a lot of Russian disinformation that enters the social media ecosystem. This can be done more or less on the cheap. The Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg exists. It is a troll farm. That is what it is. This is real. They want to do this. You don't have to pay an influencer that much, and you might not even have to pay them anything to kind of get them start to skew in a different direction. The Soviet Union has a long history of this. I mean, it's possible that Putin might have even had personal knowledge, maybe even some kind of personal involvement with supporting basically left-wing groups in the West. He was actually in the 80s stationed in Dresden. And Germany was, of course, knew this very well with the Red Army faction, a kind of Western left-wing terror organization that was actually sponsored in a fundamental way by the Soviets. So they do understand what they are doing, and do they actually want to save the white race? I mean, I think Putin is making it clear that he doesn't. Instead, the issue is weakening America and the West, creating division, promoting stupidity. I mean, there is some indication, and I don't want to read too much into this and overblow it. I'm being very cautious here. But there is some indication that Russia was kind of on the general side of the J6 protest and the kind of buffoonish coup attempt. Charles Bausman is an interesting figure in this regard, who has fled the United States, and Putin has made some comments about, America. Oh, we're monitoring the situation of, your treatment of political prisoners or something. And again, to be overly fair here, he has a point. But the issue is he really trying to like save the white race, or is he trying to spread disinformation, generate stupidity, generate chaos, and just nonsense? And I think the latter is the case. He does not have our best interest at heart. And that is clear through his actions. And
Yeah,
so,
Richard.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we should think about how Russians and Russia, how they view themselves. Because I don't know about your experience, but whenever I ask a Russian, do they feel European, they would always answer no. And that's what Russia is. It's sort of its own thing. It's not European. It's not Western. It's not Asian. It's Russia. It's their own thing. They have their own sort of civilizational understanding of
Yeah.
themselves. And I don't think they really think in these terms about like very pronounced racial issues and things like that. I don't think that that anecdote you mentioned earlier is something that actually took place, because at the time, I don't think it was Brezhnev, maybe Andropov, or but
Yeah.
Brezhnev was already very senile when Margaret Thatcher was the prime minister. So I don't think
1978. Yeah. I'll have
something
to go
like that.
look it up. Yes, but go on.
But these old Russian Soviet apparatchiks, as Nicola Paul sometimes said, that they're very racist, but at the same time, they're very much they were very much internationalists. There were these programs of African students that came to the Soviet Union. There are actually some remnants of that. There are a couple of Afro-Russians actually in Russia they are celebrities there. There actually are a few, maybe half a dozen here, and the Soviet system was very internationalist. They were not thinking in terms of race. And the Soviet Union used to support and fund these sometimes these Western groups that were sort of doing the same thing that some right groups are doing now, with sowing division and things like that. And I think it's very important to understand that their media outlets like RT, or maybe they're also their Twitter bots, the Internet Research Agency, and things like that. What they're doing is the content on RT and all these quote unquote dissident opinions and things like that, they're tailor made to appeal to certain groups which at least previously I would consider being a part of, maybe
Yeah.
you as well. I don't know, Richard, were you ever on RT?
I was on RT at least a dozen times. Yeah.
Oh,
As a
so
commentator. Yes.
and what was your experience there?
Uh, I mean, generally good. I mean, in the sense that I was treated with respect and so on. I wasn't being invited on CNN. Um, uh, they wanted an anti-American perspective, and so they would tailor everything to a kind of, the West is bad and corrupt and evil,
Yeah, that's
and
what they're doing.
let's talk about this basically. And again, I look, I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and I grew up in Texas. I mean, I am American, but obviously I have a lot of criticisms of the current world order. So, if you point me in a certain direction, I am going to say something that resonates with them. I have not been invited on for some time, and I don't. They're always changing the producers, and there are new people in there like every year or something. So it might just be that issue. But I don't. I think it's actually bigger than that. I don't think what I'm doing is what they want to spread. And you can kind of look at their personalities. I mean, there are a few of these people who are kind of like B or C grade Jon Stewart's or something. They're kind of doing the news, but they're adding in jokes and humor. But it just becomes it becomes just really, really tiresome when, I'm using an example here just to make a point, but it's like, oh, you say Russia is bad and evil. Well, keep in mind, America has the largest prison population in world history, a gulag, if you will. Just this whole like, I know you are, but what am I? Just passive aggressive argumentation. I just find extremely tiresome. And it's, you can even see it now. Like what is a lot of the kind of like 3D chess or like twist arguments that are offered by RT or
Exactly.
basically shills in the West. It's the Nazi Ukrainian government, you know, and it's just playing into these kinds of things. Now, obviously, there's a kernel of truth to this. Azov battalions are a real thing. right sector, Svoboda, etc. But the idea that these guys are like pulling the strings, or like there's a Nazi president in Kiev, is ridiculous. And so, and I think to some degree, I think Ukraine is willing to use, the extreme right as kind of a fighting force, vis-a-vis Donbass, which, it is what it is. But it's not a Nazi regime in Kiev or something. And it's just, I don't know. I just find this kind of rhetoric just excessively tiresome. And the other thing, when someone, now I'm not going to, I don't think we should be Nazis. I don't think we should be, evoking Hitler and Hitler was great and blah. I think that's bad for a number of reasons, optics being maybe the first. But when people are shrill about Nazism, it's a little bit of a tell, like the notion that, these people actually care about, European unity or the white race, and they're just like fanatically talking about Hitler. It just doesn't work. It is a bit of a tell. If you talk about that all the time, it indicates that you absolutely oppose any form of like greater European unity. And I just instantly distrust people who are kind of overly concerned with these issues.
Richard,
Yeah, and talking about European unity, I actually think that the ongoing situation in Ukraine has actually, in a way, done a lot to create more and more European unity. I mean, today the German chancellor announced that he would be suspending the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which many people claimed would be impossible, that he would not do that, but he did. Also, Ukraine has become more nationalistic and more united because of what's going on there. And it sort of plays against these Russian or Putin's goals there. So maybe 8 years ago, Ukraine would have been an easy target for Russia, but now it's far more, it will be much more difficult for Russia to do something there.
Yeah. Richard, just a tidbit to yours and Brandon's point about the ridiculous of that notion of Putin being the savior of the great white civilization. Putin was for a long time very hostile to the domestic nationalist movements in Russia. As a matter of fact, he jailed Russian nationalists at a much higher rate than other kinds of dissidents. And the only time when he kind of warmed up to them was after 2014, when they became useful for him in Donbass. And then later on, he sent a lot of them, or at least a lot of them were recruited by the likes of Wagner military contractors to go fight in other places in like Chad and Syria. And as a matter of fact, there's probably a good bit of the overall reason why he kept the Donbass conflict going for the last 8 years, so that those guys could be recycled there, and a lot of them got killed there and so forth. So otherwise they would present somewhat of a threat to him. I'm not sure how big a threat, but he rightfully perceived them as a much bigger threat than other opposition. Other opposition acted or tended to act within the realm of the law and what's legal and what's moral and so forth. And nationalism, at least in the Russian version of it, was always visceral. So they couldn't be controlled. They were more prone to kind of violent responses to everything. So it was a very convenient outlet for him to to put them in. And they were only happy to do that because that's the new cause for them to fight for greater Russia or for the oppressed Russian minorities elsewhere. Now, obviously, Syria and other African places where Wagner has operated doesn't fit into that, but nevertheless. So, and that's I've always been baffled and amused by the right in this country, at least in the last few years, how enamored they seem to be with Putin. But it's interesting whenever you start having a kind of a more detailed conversation with them about what it is about Putin that they find so appealing, their only response is, well, look at our leaders, they're so much worse. So it's kind of an equivalent to owning the libs, basically. Putin comes up with his bravado or with his kind of LARPing of pretending to defend traditional values, even though he cares nothing about traditional values. He flooded Russia with about 5 million of migrant workers from Central Asia, all of whom have or will or are on the way of becoming Russian citizens, and they're in every
that is
respect.
Evident when I was visiting Moscow.
Yeah. I mean, they're not going back, and kind of they are the right kind of people for Putin's regime to be citizens, because they always vote the right way. Those vote they will not rebel because that's their cultural milieu back home. They didn't even have an environment where they could express their will or their opinion, and and needless to say, Russia has one of the highest abortion rates, divorce rates, and so forth. If we cared anything about kind of the preservation of the nation, we wouldn't have seen that dynamic.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Visiting Russia was eye-opening for me in that regard. Mitau 1992, if that's the right way to pronounce your name. Sorry, you've been waiting patiently for an hour. Would you like to speak? You have the floor.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for this opportunity. I guess what I would like to add in terms of this conflict in particular, I think the coming significance of it is to be sort of like shown in the future, because as we look in the Russian history, I think we can see a precedent of every upcoming Russian leader sort of going through some sort of like conflict that he has to sort of like resolve. Yeltsin had his 1993 failed coup d'etat. Putin basically legitimized himself through having like this swift and even cold reaction towards terror acts in the Russian state. And I do think that this conflict could potentially pave a road for a new inheritor for Kremlin. I personally would not be surprised if that were the case.
So you're talking about a new leadership, or kind of?
Yeah, pretty much.
In which direction?
I think it would probably be some of Putin's inner circle, simply as seeing how Putin was handpicked by Yeltsin himself previously. Yeah. I do think that the time is approaching to where Putin will ultimately have to step away, at least from the limelight of Russian sort of like public power relations. And I do think that that there isn't a better time to earn the approval of like the Russian Volksgeist, if you will, than a time of like a decisive conflict. So yeah,
I agree.
That would be.
No, I think that's a very good point. All right, Mufti Wilfred Al-Spectrum, you have the floor.
Thanks. So earlier, I tuned in pretty late, but I'm curious if you believe that people on the right in the West should like disavow or distance themselves from the more far right element of the conflict? Is that something you think is just like shouldn't be touched? Is that like not a good thing?
What do you mean exactly?
Well, like, you have openly far right groups active, like Azov. I'm not a fan, but
right.
Things like that. Where do you think it's just counterproductive? Like, does anything good come of supporting them, or is it just a waste of breath? I suppose.
Oh, either supporting them or denouncing them. Yeah, I'm not going to do either of those things. I mean, this is a conflict that, it does affect me in some regard. But it's not a conflict that's promoting, my vision of the future. And I think I have a certain critical distance from it all. But I generally don't go around shrilly denouncing people. And I think that, getting really excited about these, banderist or whatever, or right sector, Svoboda, or, the Azov battalion, I think that's also, for lack of a better word, cringe. These guys are in a particular situation. They are distanced from power. They're kind of tolerated. I'm not sure they're going to be tolerated later on. And there's a peculiar element to them. There's a really strong thuggish and violent element to them. I mean, I don't think a lot is gained by claiming that they are the future, but I'm also not going to go around denouncing people or anything like that. That's kind of my position. Okay. You can, Master Shake, you can jump in anytime. Let's go to Jake Heron. Anime avatar frightens me a little bit. We'll see what happens here.
Yeah. Anyway, so Richard Spencer, I mean, look, I mean, you've grown in my eyes. I mean, a lot of the stuff you're saying about how, we shouldn't, be crazy about Hitler for no reason, but we also shouldn't like denounce him as, a lot of that stuff is very correct. But have you seen John J. Mersheimer's, who's this realist political foreign policy
I know
analyst?
John.
Have you seen his?
Mersheimer. I sat in for some lectures
I like
of his in Chicago. Yes, I like him quite a bit. Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting. But have you seen his lecture? I think I retweeted it just now about why the Ukraine crisis is fundamentally the West's fault. And he talks about how in the Bucharest conference in 2008, NATO said, we're going to expand into Georgia and Ukraine. And that's really like the beginning, one of the main causes of the crisis.
Yes, I have seen that.
They didn't really say
lecture.
that.
Go ahead, Master Shea.
Well, no,
as I mentioned
what
at the beginning, they never really said that they would expand there. What they said is that the doors of NATO would be open to Ukraine and Georgia when the time comes. That they're open to the idea of accepting them. That they're not willing to expand there at any cost. When they are ready, when they have all the reforms in place, when they have all the standards in place, then it may be when they are ready, they could be accepted. That's what they said. It wasn't a declaration.
Okay, so you added. Yeah, okay, so you did add some nuance, admittedly. But again, the point is that this NATO expansion, which was a breaking of a treaty, like a rule that between the USSR and America that they wouldn't expand eastwards, so they just broke that rule. After the Cold War ended, and then of course when they said, "Oh, we're interested in getting Ukraine into the into NATO," I mean, this is what fundamentally caused the war there. So I mean, I agree with you that I think it is the West's fault. I mean,
it's nuance. It's nuance. I mean, I did a tweet thread this morning in which I said, I mean, there is a driving impulse of NATO towards expansion. And you can just simply look at the map. I mean, NATO has gone into former Warsaw Pact countries. There was a kind of tacit agreement of, I think it's, we won't expand one more inch or something like that is broken. But, rules are made to be broken. I mean, there is an interest in the United States, a long-term interest of Europe is important, and heartland Europe is very important, and even relates to the German question. So I mean, these things are there and real. I think Mersheimer was perhaps being a bit provocative, because Mersheimer is he's a realist, he's a hard-headed realist, and I think in the current environment he's a contrarian. He doesn't, he delights in the notion of saying, well, we're not going to go fight for human rights, we're going to fight for our interests lie elsewhere. I think he was being a bit provocative and just claiming it's all the West's fault. This is not to let the West off the hook, of course, or deny the nature of NATO, but I think it's being a bit provocative. The only thing that I would add to this is that, and I think Mersheimer grasped this in that lecture. I mean, there is a long-term continuity to the concept of a Russian sphere, and he would readily admit that. I would add, and this is just again my reading, that I'm just looking at Putin, looking at his actions, thinking through these things. My reading again is that Putin kind of wants this neo-Cold War, that he doesn't want to reach out to the West and be the savior of the white race. He wants a neo-Cold War, and there's going to be a lot of pain in that. But hunkering down and suffering is actually breeds stability. The situation becomes clear, and I think he wants to kind of like make things that are implicit or ambiguous explicit. And so I think it is his fault as well. I don't want to just simply blame the West or blame America. I think that's rather childish, and I think he wants this too.
Yeah, but I think the reason why a lot of these people are supporting Putin as this based whatever is because of this kind of like third worldist anti-American nationalism, third worldist anti-American contrarianism, which I really dislike. And again, Russia is kind of included, but also kind of excluded. It's not purely white. It's not really Western, but it is white. Like it's this weird thing. And I think people like Dugin are really into that. That's what they are. I mean, I don't think Dugin is a very serious person, let's say. I think he's fundamentally a Russian nationalist who is using these things. Like there was this this quote of Dugin's where he conflated Ukrainian neo-Nazis, NATO, being in favor of gay marriage, being against Venezuela, and a 10 trillion other things. And and the only connection is that they're vaguely kind of like Western, let's say, and against Russia. But obviously there's no connection between these things. It's just that he's a kind of Ukrainian, like kind of Russian kind of pan-nationalist, not exactly an ethno-nationalist, and he's not a white nationalist, definitely. And he's kind of trying to be anti-Western, and he's conflating with being Western with being liberal, which I hate. So again, he's this kind of, this guy called the chairman of Spring, Xi Jinping, just tweeted this thing that I retweeted about how Dugin openly says he's trying to like support various, let's say, subversives or kind of like dissident elements in America in order to cause trouble. The reason why they're supporting, I mean, admittedly, people like you, and I'm not saying that you are a Duginist. That's not what I'm saying. But admittedly, they are kind of, the reason why Russia or Dugin is doing these things is not because they generally care about the white race. It's to destabilize America. So. Exactly.
And I think I have been able to see through this. I noticed also something with this guy who perhaps I'm fixating a little too much on, but his name is like Caleb Maupin. He's written this book about how Jesus is a socialist, and it's this book of like quotes from Martin Luther King and Jesus Christ and whatever. And they just support, I mean, on some level, it's basically anything that's Western or opposed to Russia. But on some level, it's just anything that's just kind of crappy. It's like, I'm a big fan of Cuba and Venezuela and Russia and the Donbass Republic and the trucker protest and J6. And it's like, you have a libido for things that are just gross, and it's just like anything that's going against like success or wealth or beauty or whatever. They
or
they
just the
just love,
establishment.
and they just love the victim. And I'm just tired of it. And again, look,
Yeah.
I think I have a nuanced opinion on like the trucker protest or Russia or whatever, and it's not
Yeah.
just a hostile one. I think I'm able to kind of see things, and but when your entire perspective, this one struggle concept,
Yeah.
when your entire perspective is built on just like resentment, victimology, and ugliness,
Populism.
like the uglier the better. I'm just tired of it. These one struggle people they're for the birds, in my opinion.
And I
Oh,
think
yeah,
we should
obviously.
also talk about how we are framing the discussion about NATO expansion or sympathies towards Russia or something like that, because I think it correlates with the distance, geographical distance you have from Russia. The further away you are, the more pro-Russian you are, and
Kind of like with
vice
war.
versa, perhaps. Yeah. Living here where I live on the border of Russia, my country's been in EU and NATO for 20 years now, almost 20 years. I don't really think that I would be enjoying the level of life I have here if not for these institutions. If there's actually a very binary choice, either you have that, well, as a small country, of course, you have to give that, but I would be living in a country that's pretty much like Ukraine was, or maybe still is, like Belarus, like these Central Asian countries, these crypto-Soviet dictatorships, and I wouldn't like to live there. And I don't think people who far away from here who espouse these sympathies towards these regimes today would actually want to live there as well. So that's one thing.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, the reason why I kind of like I'm somewhat sympathetic to you, Spencer, is because again, you're kind of against the dissidents. Like you're attacking the dissident right from within the dissident right? Like you're not some. Like you
Yes.
kind of attack a lot of these kind of like stupid, like really, and even though we have significant disagreements, I have to admit, I mean that's what I like about. That's also what I like about Nigel Carlsbad, which I'm shilling him all the time because he's also like criticizes a lot of the stupid stuff that goes on in these kind of areas where it's just like this kind of idiotic populism and just a lot of this simplification of things and yeah.
Well, I appreciate that. Mitao, you wanted to jump in again? And Nikopol as well, but you can jump in first.
Yeah, I would say that that especially when it comes to figures like Maupin and quote unquote accusations of Russian money, I think all you need to do is just look up his Wikipedia page, which clearly states that he has been an employee of RT for 15 years around.
Yeah.
At this point, and he's and I do think that his sympathies with all of these sort of like, I guess for the lack of a better term, reactionary events happening in America is this it's nothing but ideological masturbation, in my opinion. There's very little substance out of his sort of particular brand of weird Heideggerian communism. It's a it's a rather bizarre thing to observe.
I totally agree. I mean that's the way I see it as well. It's extremely reactionary. It's all vicarious. It's all happening elsewhere, and it's just like rooting on underdogs of all sorts, rooting on anything that's like lashing out without purpose. It's just at this point, it just kind of drives me crazy. I think I always had these instincts. I was highly critical of Brexit at the time. I opposed Brexit, in fact. Nikopol, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just because you were kind of discussing Dugin, I just realized that a lot of you kind of don't realize, but kind of 2 points. First is Dugin If you want to read him and read his philosophy and ideology, whatever, do so. But as far as Kremlin power is concerned, he doesn't matter at all. Dugin kind of projected for a while this, and a lot of Western journalists, especially the lazy ones, which, let's be honest, is a majority, kind of fell onto it that he's this kind of a Rasputin behind a Putin. Dugin had years ago a large conflict with a guy named Surkov. Surkov is a close confidant of Putin. He's the one who helped him to get a presidency. He's very close to him. And he's been even fired from his position at the university. So don't read Dugin as something like what's in Putin's mind. Like, that's nowhere close to it. And the second one, like, I just realized that if you don't speak Russian, you probably don't realize it, and Boris will be able to confirm it. But in Russia, you have two words for Russian as an ethnicity and Russian as a citizenship or nationality. So even if you are reading Russian authors which are speaking about Russia and Russians, keep this in mind. They don't have to necessarily be speaking about Russian ethnic, which is about 80% of Russia, but Russia as an idea of a nation, which includes in current Russia also like Ossetians, Tuvans, and all these ethnic minorities from all over the place. So just keep that in mind. That's closer to something you would call Americans, like this large melting pot it's obviously not a melting pot of a cultures, but it's like overall term, which can also extend. That's kind of when Putin is saying Ukrainians are basically Russians, this is what he means. He recognizes them as ethnicity, but he sees it as ethnicity as part of these overall large Russian nations, which covers the entire Russian world, which he calls it. So also keep this kind of a little distinction and nuance in mind, and many things will become much clearer in the context. That's all.
Yes, I agree. Okay, Jerome, do you want to jump in? This has gone longer than I expected, but it's a really good conversation. I've had some of the better guests, I guess, who have offered their perspectives. So we should do more talk about Russia. But Jerome, do you want to jump in?
Yes. Hello, Richard.
Hello.
Just wanted to. I've tuned in a bit late, so I don't know if you talked about it. But I think this conflict is different this time because I feel like, at least in Western Europe, I mean, from France where I am, like in the dissident right, and I think more broadly the more national right, which had more sympathy for Russia, he lost a lot of credibility during the Belarus migrant crisis. I don't know if you talked about it during this.
We'll go on. I don't think we mentioned it
like
specifically.
because I feel like it was mediatized a lot, and basically, Belarus. I mean, let's take the assumption that it is like just a satellite state. I mean, basically, if we do something, it's because Putin allows it. And they flew in like a bunch of Iraqis and Syrians in Belarus and like just put them at the border in like the Baltics and in Poland. And like,
interesting.
I don't know if in the US it was a big story, but in Europe it was huge. And
yeah, go ahead, Master Sheikh, if you want to jump. So you're taking us back to 2015. Is that when this occurred?
No, it's last year.
Oh, okay.
But maybe Jerome can finish his point, and then I can because I can talk in length about this.
Okay. And finish your point, Jerome, and then.
My point was just basically that, like, it seems like Putin has gone insane with this because, like, how can he have sympathy? Like, I mean, just flying in Iraqis and just putting them at the border, it's like almost biological warfare, since the Biden crisis. Like, it was just a crazy political decision. And a lot of people, at least I feel like in France, in the dissident right, have just turned their back on Putin. Like, he's just insane.
Well, I have too. I actually did not know that much about this issue, but
have you heard anything about the Belarus border crisis, Richard?
No, I haven't. Why don't you explain the situation?
So it actually goes back to 2020. In 2020, there was this presidential election in Belarus. Belarus is this crypto Soviet state, pretty much like I would like to sort of compare it to North Korea, but it's not as hardcore as North Korea. But it's
Yeah.
essentially a Soviet republic that's still Soviet. They have their one leader that they have had since '94. Basically, the president who wins all the elections. Well, you know the drill. They had an election in 2020, and the opposition was very sort of strong. They were confident that, well, maybe they won't win, but they certainly would have a certain amount of the popular support. And of course, the election came out like the overwhelming majority for the sitting president and things like that. And there was this large popular uprising, sort of like what the Russian media called the attempted color revolution in Belarus. Of course, there were very major crackdowns. People were arrested, imprisoned, mistreated, killed. Even I actually know a few Belarusians who live here, whose family members were imprisoned there. And as a response to this crackdown, the EU introduced sanctions against Belarus, specifically against the leadership of Belarus. And as a response, or sort of as an act of revenge against the EU, Alexander Lukashenko and his government started to organize passenger flights to places like Iraq, Turkey, some places in Africa, North Africa, and they basically started flying in quote unquote refugees or migrants to Belarus, to the Minsk airport. And then they put them on buses and bussed them to the Polish and Lithuanian and Latvian borders, where they basically let them loose. You can cross the border, you can cross into the EU. Here you go, EU, have some migrants, something like that. And this actually is still going on to this day. Many people probably think that it has stopped. It reached its peak at the autumn, late summer of last year, when there were like these groups of thousands of people who were just sitting on the border and waiting to cross. And Poland and Lithuania had actually started building like real walls, like Trumpian border walls, to their border with Belarus to stop them from crossing. But Poland and Lithuania sort of built these fortifications on their borders, but they're still going over the Latvian border. There's on average 40 to 80 migrants trying to cross the border into the EU here, but the border guards are pushing them back. And only in some cases of medical emergencies, or if they have like babies or children, they sort of let them in. But they push back the overwhelming majority of these migrants. And a lot of them are still located in Belarus. They have been there throughout the winter in very harsh conditions. But they sort of want to go back. The Iraqi government is actually organizing flights to fly them back. But I think some of those migrants are actually like held hostage by the Belarusian regime on the border, just to be sort of forced over into the EU. So that's what's going on here.
Wow. Yeah. No, that does seem to be warfare by another means. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, X, do you want to jump in? Oh, sorry, I'll let you in there. Okay, and we'll have to bring this to a close pretty soon, but X, why don't you be the last speaker, and then I'll see if anyone wants to add in any final
Yes.
thoughts.
Hey, has anybody seen? Yes. Hello. Has anybody seen "Servant of the People"? It was starring President Zelensky before he was president of Ukraine. He was sort of like a Trump kind of guy. He was in their version of Hollywood. It's a really popular series. I'm not making this up. I know it sounds totally nuts. Where he was a school teacher who later becomes president of Ukraine. He saves Ukraine. He modernizes Ukraine in this series called Servant of the People. And so then later on, he became president of Ukraine. So I know he's a minor part of this whole story because we're all fixated on Putin, right? Who's more of the alpha in this story. But I was just curious if anybody had heard of this, if any of your speakers had heard of this particular series. I believe it's also on Netflix.
Wow, no, I've not heard of
Yeah,
it.
I've
So
heard of it, but I haven't
it's on
seen it.
Netflix. It's like subtitled or dubbed.
Yeah,
right now.
it's serving other people. It's also on YouTube. You can pretty much watch the whole series. I watched a couple of episodes. It's kind of funny. Yeah, it's probably the most unique situation where a guy plays president of a country and then actually the actor becomes president of that country. And it's pretty
And as a
mind-boggling.
fun fact, the ruling party of Ukraine is currently called Servant of the People.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
That is hilarious. I mean, there's a lot of echoes of Trump and Reagan and all of these people. It's almost where the Hollywood image becomes the real thing. It's fascinating.
I mean, the reason is because the channel is owned by one of the richest oligarch of the Ukraine, called Kolomoisky. Mm-hmm. And basically, it's kind of accepted that Zelensky is his guy. And Kolomoisky is making like all the big calls, and he was put there as a popular actor and as kind of a centrist who is against corruption, yada yada. And people knew him from the television, and it worked.
Interesting. All right, Bartimu, do you want to jump in real quick? Let me. I'll add you as a speaker, and then okay, we have my good friends. Bartimu and yes, I can. An obvious sock puppet. I'll let you guys talk. You guys are long-time listeners and long-time callers, so you can jump in first.
Yes, you were talking about the thing about that people talking about neo-Nazism in Ukraine. That's a red flag for you. And I was thinking, and I thought that was interesting because I think, I mean, these are not any marginal figures who like just one person which gets brought up. I think that's something when you see these neo-Nazis in Ukraine, that's something that you see quite regularly. I mean, The Guardian, for instance, they had this I think article, that's a grandma or something, where there was this woman who was practicing self-defense in it was in western part in Ukraine, and she turned out to be some member of some militia, and also that and also that which was prominently featured in BBC and Guardian, and also that demonstration in Kharkiv.
Well, the difference is, so there was I saw this scandal. So there was a report in mainstream media. I think it might have even been on like NBC in the United States, where they have some old woman who's training to fight against the Russians, and then people looked into it a little bit further, and she's wearing like neo-Nazi garb. It's kind of funny, but it's an interesting situation because it's like the liberal press is promoting her and maybe whitewashing or ignoring, or maybe like genuinely ignoring, genuinely unaware of her, the nature of her battalion. And then it's basically the kind of like alt left that are promoting this. And they're like, look, you can't, the mainstream media is whitewashing Nazism. And look at all this, they're the ones kind of promoting it. Whereas the mainstream media are the ones kind of turning a blind eye. It's interesting dynamic.
Yes, and but yes, I do think it's interesting dynamic, and but I do think that there really is something like that which exists in Ukraine, and like you were mentioning that demonstration in Kharkiv, and there were flags of it was some black and red flags, like literally, who watched associated with some parts. So I do think that's a real force which exists there, and I do think that that they should be taken seriously. And I don't think, I mean, some of this might be a bit exaggerated by the Russian side, but I do think it's something that exists, and it's not like it's. I mean, these organizations would be banned if they existed in any Western country because they're so well organized. I think.
Yeah.
The black and red flags are not like a Nazi symbol per se. It's a symbol of their national resistance movement and their nationalist movement. It's not like their swastika or whatever.
But aren't they associated with that World War II movement? I think.
Yeah, they are, but it's not necessarily like a Nazi organization. It's not necessarily pro-Nazi organization. It's also uses that flag, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's the symbol of that.
Yeah, but I'm not going to argue that. I do think, yes, I do think if people use some symbol associated with the Vichy government in France, people would think that would be sort of suspicious.
Yeah, the black and white flag is a flag of a movement called the Right Sector. It's the connection with kind of the neo-Nazi movement is at best very tortured, if any. It kind of traces its origins back to the Stepan Bandera movement during World War II, who was the leader of the Ukrainian nationalists. And even though he fought the Soviet army, he never became part of the German military. And as a matter of fact, he made a point of distancing himself. And one thing that is also interesting is that after World War II was over, Ukrainian nationalist units fought a guerrilla war in the kind of the rural areas of Western Ukraine until 1961. It was 1961 when it finally was completely put down, and the Soviets went very harshly after them. I mean, a lot of people were sentenced to death and imprisoned for long terms. But it's pretty amazing that 16 years after the war was over, they were still fighting, and the Soviets couldn't do much about it. Even with back in the day, the Stalinist repressive machine was pretty formidable, and they did not tolerate anything of that nature anywhere else in the country.
All right. Obvious sock puppet, do you want to jump in? And then we'll bring it to a close. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, mate. Yeah. So it was a little bit early for me to get on this discussion, so I missed most of it. But it's been a good discussion. I just one little warning to all the Eastern Europeans that are within the EU and within NATO. It's just it seems to me the closer you are to the Russian border, the more NATO and the EU and Western media allows you to be, for lack of a better term, base. You're allowed to be chauvinist. You're allowed to be militaristic up to a certain point, and your society is allowed to be a little bit, I'd say, 20 or 30 years behind the West socially. So I just want to. The warning is, if you stay within our sphere, which is the Western sphere, you're going to have Anglo problems very, very soon. In 20 years, you're going to have starting to look like the UK. So that's just my little warning for it.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, I think that every country in the world is going to succumb to a virus that's far worse than coronavirus, and that is the woke virus. We want to use that term. I mean, I do think it's coming everywhere eventually. And I also do agree with your notion of like the United States will tolerate a certain kind of badass nationalism in Poland because they see it as in their advantage, and it's kind of like having tough guys on the frontier. But eventually there will be gay pride parades in Warsaw. I of course agree with that, but I would extend that to Russia. I mean, one interesting thing is that after the Cold War, the former Soviet Union was far more based, and you can even see this in polling. I actually was working on this section in one of Ed Dutton's books, but there's a Pew Research polls. So, I mean, again, take everything with a grain of salt, any kind of polling, but I think it does show something where just levels of tolerance were much higher in the West and Northern Europe in particular. And so a lot of Eastern Europe and Russia would be like, well, I would not accept a Jew or a Muslim as a family member or something. So you could kind of see this based or bigoted or traditional outlook that was still there. So it's kind of fascinating that these are the people who grew up under godless communism, yet they're more conservative than the West that was almost part of a more advanced stage of liberalism. I think that is very true. But I would add that I think this mind virus of wokeism is going to eventually go everywhere. And it's going to be in Russia. It's going to be everywhere. I think it will be most intense in white Christian countries, but I think it will probably be in Southeast Asia as well. It's just a kind of like terrible virus that everyone has to deal with. And so again, the notion that Poland is so amazing, that's the future. Russia is so amazing, that's the future because it's based and trad and supposedly socialist and so on. I think it's more of a case that they're 25 years behind due to the twists and turns of history, and that they will eventually be where we are. I would affirm that. So it's not
I wouldn't say that we're like 20 years behind. I mean, it depends on the so-called social bubble you're in, because I would say that we're pretty much at the same level as the West because of the advent of social media, and people here read the same articles, follow the same people on social media as in the West. But it's mostly pronounced among the younger people. I mean, the older people who are around 30 or older, I think that they're immune, to be honest. There have been attempts. There were a couple of gay pride parades in the mid to late 2000s, but then they just kind of stopped because only straight high school and college girls and maybe some NGO activists went on those. And they just sort of understood that there really is no point in organizing it annually. I think that, but there's a gay pride parade once every 3 years here, something like that. But only
aren't they organised by the US
girls
Embassy?
attend those.
Aren't gay pride parades, and isn't there a report, Richard, by a US? It's a US government organisation that say specifically Estonia is too white. I remember seeing an article about that.
That wouldn't shock me at all.
Yeah. So I hate to say devil's advocate, but you have to understand what the future lies. But Richard thinks it's inevitable for all the world. But the only thing I could think of is I've never been to Belarus. I'm sure there might be people who've been to Belarus or someone who's from Belarus in the chat. But I contrast the social bubble that Belarus is in, and I don't know if Estonia borders Belarus, but I don't think there's any gay pride parades full stop in Belarus. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I would. I mean, this is another discussion. I do think the mind virus is going to sweep the globe, and I mean, one of the things that we're gonna there's a new book, Ed Dutton book called Spiteful Mutants, which will hopefully be out in May or so. But it's kind of the new crucible of evolution. Like if you're immune to this or you can resist it, then you're going to survive, and if you succumb to it, you're going to be destroyed. So it's basically a bottleneck kind of idea. So I think it's just I don't doubt that the U.S. Embassy is doing this. The U.S. Embassy, they were flying BLM stuff at one point. They were, of course they are, but look, the presidential spokesman is Jen Psaki, who's like she reminds me of a graduate student in women's studies or something at Yale. I mean, yes, this is definitely happening. I don't want to dismiss that, but I would stress the kind of like macro quality of this. It is a logical unfolding of Western nihilism in general. And it's going to ultimately happen everywhere. And maybe poverty can kind of protect you from it, but I'm not necessarily sure that's a great way of protecting you from the pause, as it were. But okay.
I mean, there is. So
go ahead. Yeah.
I'll just quickly say that Slavic people, according to Dutton at least, are more negatively ethnocentric.
Yes.
So that might be a fact.
I agree. I agree. But, keep in mind as well, like being negatively ethnocentric is also a kind of sign of lower intelligence. And it can also kind of come out in times of stress as well. I mean, I think you can even see a certain kind of negative ethnocentrism among Americans who are getting back into the whole Cold War thing. It is a kind of sign of things are more precarious. You wouldn't have seen this 10 years ago. You certainly wouldn't have seen it 20 years ago. Okay, real quick, Mufti Wilfred, and then we'll call. I'll let Master Sheikh get a final word, and then we'll call it quits.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, I'm on cellular
Yes.
now. Okay, excellent.
Sure.
So, I finally figured out how to link tweets. There's a little series of spaces that was done recently about the background. It's by an account, Peter Nimitz. Pretty interesting. Recorded them for those who are interested in some of the broader background. Just figured I'd put that out there. That's it.
Interesting.
Has he already started to do spaces about the more recent history of Ukraine? Because the ones I listened to were way too back.
Not yet.
Interesting to me.
He had a busy week with work and canceled that weekend. He hasn't figured out when he's doing the next thing.
All right.
Yeah, follow him and you'll figure that out.
I've listened to those. They're pretty interesting, but they go a bit way too back for me to be interesting. I'll just wait when he starts to talk about more recent things. I think we should end, Richard, with predictions. What do we think? What will happen around Ukraine?
Okay. Well, I might get myself in trouble here. I think I'm going to stick to my guns. I would say that within a reasonable amount of time, that is within a year to 2 years, that these Donbass regions are going to be in some way, unified with the Russian Federation, or to be kind of like satellite states like Belarus. I do strongly think that a full invasion of Ukraine is on the table. I've been a little bit, I don't know what the right word is. I'm taking some, I now have some pause after what you've said. But I guess I should, at the very least, to create a good dynamic here, I'll stick to my guns and say that this is going to unfold. And we are going to see some kind of serious invasion. And then you can take the more reasonable position and be proven right. So I'll let you have that.
Yeah, well, I think that actually one more point. Today, when they ratified those decrees recognizing the independence of those people's republics, they didn't actually know what kind of territory were they talking about, the territory they control now or the territory of the actual oblasts. So Putin had to do a press conference afterwards to clarify that they're actually talking about the whole oblast territories. So I think that there's going to be a military movement there. It's going to take place in those regions, but it's not really going to go. It will not be a full-on invasion of Ukraine.
It won't go to Kiev, basically.
It won't go to Kiev in the sense that there won't be tanks going to Kiev. But when in late December, the Russians sort of wrote this letter to the United States and NATO, having those demands, what they would like to have. And when they responded, they weren't very satisfied with the answer. So they said that they would follow with the quote unquote military technical response. So I think that they're going to keep those troops around Ukraine for some time to just spread out Ukrainian forces. And they might do some limited military action like missile strikes or something like that within the Ukrainian territory, but they won't actually go into Ukrainian territory. The main conflict will happen in the eastern Ukraine still.
Yes,
so
I think what you're saying is
my prediction.
Yeah, what you're saying is very reasonable. Will probably be proven correct. I think there's an interesting question is going to be Biden's response, because Biden explicitly said in an address last week that he will send support and materiel, but no ground troops, effectively. I think this is a Cold War type posture. It also bespeaks a kind of declining empire in a way that Biden is managing. He's managing to pull out of Afghanistan. He's managing a somewhat smaller footprint of the U.S. empire. So, I mean, do you think what is the I won't make you say yes or no, but what is the possibility, like as a percentage, that Washington really changes its tune and is basically saying, like, there's a hard line. We are going to directly engage in action in Ukraine if you pass. What chance of that do you think there is?
Well, already tonight, when we started our discussion, Biden had his press conference where he announced financial sanctions against Russia and Russian leadership.
Right.
So that's already taking place. But honestly, I don't really think that there are going to be any significant military support from the United States or NATO or any other country. Ukraine is essentially alone in this, like Finland was in 1939, like other places have been. But there still will be, I think, weapons deliveries and things like that, like military support in that sense, but not actual boots on the ground.
Yeah. So you'd say there's a 95% chance of continuing this policy or so. Very small chance of changing.
Yes.
That's my view too. All right, guys. This was a fantastic discussion. And I really appreciate the listeners' comments, because we brought in people who know quite a bit about the background and added a lot of detail and nuance. So I appreciate that greatly. And anyway, I will be back. I'm going to start doing regular spaces on Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern time. I think
way too late for me.
Yeah, that is late night. I think GMT
it's like 4 a.m.
5. Yeah, it's even worse for you. Well, they're recorded. But I think this discussion topic brought out a lot of good people, so we should probably do another midday discussion. Maybe in a couple of weeks or a month when things have changed. So that'd be good.
Yeah. And I think it's pretty good to have these spaces on like European friendly times as well. So you have a lot of perspective that you wouldn't have otherwise.
I absolutely agree with that as well. Americans have a particular perspective, but I was actually, I think it's much more rewarding to listen to the, again, detail and nuance that people brought with this one. So anyway, sorry if you didn't get in, but thank you everyone who participated and listened. And I will talk to many of you on Friday, and we'll do this again soon. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye. Ciao.